when we're talking about propaganda, it's always two-way. We have to look at why people want to believe the disinformation. What does it appeal to? What anxieties or biases does it play into? So, disinformation which doesn't play into something does fall by the wayside.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine is not just an attempt to change the geographical boundaries in Europe, but it's also a fight on another dividing line, that between the truth and falsehood. Whether it's a former advisor to Putin telling us it's the Ukrainians killing their own civilians in Mariupol, or Russian state TV saying the country could submerge the UK with just one missile. Peter Pomeranzev is a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins University, and his most recent book is This Is Not Propaganda, Adventures in the War Against Reality. Morning to you, Peter.
Morning, how's it going?
Very well. How effective then is Russia's disinformation war?
So this term disinformation is a bit of a red herring a lot of the time. Very rarely when we look at these sort of campaigns, are we dealing with outright falsehoods? I mean, even going back to the Russian campaign to influence the US election, most of it wasn't falsehoods. It was just saying Trump is great and Hillary is evil. So most of these things are just attitudinal. The really powerful stuff that Russia is doing internationally at the moment is drawing this kind of very effective false equivalence between, on the one hand, generous feelings that many European countries have towards Ukraine, and on the other hand, kind of self-interest. So, why should we suffer higher gas prices? We've been nice to the Ukrainians already. Instead of this really being about how do we stop Russia being a threat to all of Europe. So that's a much more sophisticated reframing of the arguments, and that's having mainstream traction. It's repeated by the most powerful people in the Czech Republic, in Germany. And that is far more important than the sort of disinformation pockets that appeal to sort of the fringes on the far left and far right about war crimes denialism.
What is the West doing to combat any kind of information or disinformation, whatever you want to call it, that's coming out of the Kremlin?
Well, I mean, firstly, the West, so the EU in particular, took some very, very strong steps right at the start of the war to ban Russian state media, which has been quite a controversial move now. There's a group of Dutch academics who are pushing back against this, saying it's an attack on free speech. So that was one of the most spectacular moves forward. Or sideways, or backwards.
Yes. The West themselves have sometimes bought into the disinformation. In 2014, Putin described his army as little green men, apparently, and this was picked up and actually used by many Western journalists, which seems incredible.
Yeah, it became a shorthand, but look, propaganda is always a two-way street. You can't force people to believe something they don't want to believe. So when you go back to 2014 invasion, there was this sort of rather alarming pause when, even though everyone knew these were Russian soldiers taking over Crimea, a lot of Western governments would say, like, oh, well, we just can't be sure, can we? But that was a very disingenuous position. They didn't want to enter into any sort of tension with Russia because they had deep economic or social ties with it. So look, when we're talking about propaganda, it's always two-way. We have to look at why people want to believe the disinformation. What does it appeal to? What anxieties or biases does it play into? So, disinformation which doesn't play into something does fall by the wayside.
And who believes this stuff?
Well, people who want to. I mean, it's basically the very simple reason. But what we do know, though, from kind of the social sciences, if you throw different stuff at people, they will get confused. So if you just throw contradictory evidence at people, they can get confused. And probably if we're talking about an effective kind of like tactic, the Kremlin and many others use, it is that kind of confusion. That's certainly something that was used by tobacco companies. You just had tobacco on. Tobacco companies to sort of confuse and dilute the truth about the connection between tobacco and smoking, used by fossil fuel companies to undermine the connection between climate change and fossil fuels. But again, after a while, it really gets to the point where the people who keep on disbelieving this stuff are doing it for very, very deep reasons, because which need to be explored. It's not because they're naive. It's because at some fundamental level they're drawn to these arguments.
The Kremlin over the decades, has been accused of putting out disinformation. How has that changed when you look at the current methods, modus operandi almost, of how they're doing it? How has it changed, and what should we be aware of?
So, I mean, their playbook is fairly well established now. They've been developing it over years. It changes as the technology changes, but it's a full spectrum attempt to influence other countries. And it goes all the way from troll farms and state media through to representatives of the UN and high-level politicians. And then, the golden aim of any propaganda campaign is to do it through others. So do it through proxies. So usually sort of bought politicians like Gerhard Schroeder and so on and so forth, or allegedly bought politicians before I get sued by someone. So they use all those tools, and it's centralized. And we don't really have anything comparable. I mean, the British government will do the odd statement, they'll do the odd sort of stratcoms or campaign, but after the Cold War, we kind of abandoned any kind of systemic approach to democratic communication across the world. And I think that's being reviewed now. I think there's a sense that we can't compete with Russia and China. They have their nasty information war tactics, which I just enumerated. What's going to be the democratic version of that?
Peter, thank you very much for that. Very interesting. Peter Pomeranzev, who is a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins University.